What's up everybody, and welcome back to the channel and to another Elden Ring video. Now, a couple of days ago I made a video on stat breakpoints, it should be up here in the corner, that basically set a basis for us to discuss how to build certain archetypes in the game. So definitely I would suggest you to give that a look first, but essentially it discusses which points you start seeing diminishing returns in certain stats. And my next plan after that, as mentioned in that video, was to start creating the blueprints for certain archetypes in the game. This is, for instance, like a straight up caster focusing on sorceries, a bleed build based melee build that's focusing on strength and the bleed mechanic on weapons, a hybrid melee and faith caster, a straight faith caster, you know, all of those different ones. And today's video was the first one in that series, looking at a straightforward sorcerer focusing on casting spells to deal their damage. And this is the first build that I played in Elden Ring, so that's why it seems apt that this would be the first one that I bring in here. Now, a quick disclaimer of sorts when it comes to discussing builds in Elden Ring. Something that we have to bear in mind is, technically speaking, things like class choice and which points you put into which stats matter less and less the deeper you go into the game, aka the higher you level up. So by the time you get to something like level 200, level 250, level 300, it really doesn't matter anymore, because you'll have so many points to access and so many points that you can distribute across all of the stats in the game that you won't really have to conform to the I am a sorcerer or I am a melee, and you could literally dabble in everything. However, it is interesting that if you are specifically trying to tap into the PvP meta, in other words, you have a certain level that you don't go past, so whether that's 80 or 125, 120, 150, whatever the meta settles on, then your choice of points will matter. But then secondly as well, one of the most beautiful things about Elden Ring really is the fact that there really isn't just one way of doing things. So I'm just some dude on the internet with a beard that I have some opinions as to why I build it in a certain way, and that's really the thing that I want to discuss, because I might give you some ideas as to why you would go to 40 vigor, for instance, and not 30, just as an example. So diving into the spreadsheet here, firstly, class choice and how that matters for when you're playing a sorcerer. Now, really the only two choices that make sense straight off the bat is either the astrologer or the prisoner. But does that mean that if you start as a samurai that you can't eventually be a spellcaster given enough, points into intelligence and mind and all of that? No, not at all. That is exactly the point that I was trying to make in the disclaimer earlier. But that is that given enough levels and enough points, any class can do anything. But starting off, and if you are focusing on the first 50 levels of your journey or the first 100 levels, definitely two characters that stand out, two classes that stand out for sorcery is obviously the astrologer and the prisoner. Now, personally, for me, I believe that the astrologer is the stronger candidate for this, and it's also the one that I chose. That's simply because the two stats which are very, very important for you, especially early on in the game, because they define not only the damage that you can produce, but also how much of that you can cast before you have to drink a potion and get yourself back up again, is of course mind, which is your mana, and of course intelligence, which governs, the strength of your spells, but also which spells you can cast. So the astrologer starts at level 6, the prisoner starts at level 9. However, starting at level 6, the astrologer starts with 15 in mind and 16 in intelligence, which is really good. The other thing that I really like though as well is that even though the prisoner starts with 2 points more dexterity, we do also see 12 for the astrologer, and we know that dexterity is super important when it comes to actually the speed at which you cast. Now, 2 points isn't going to make all that difference, but eventually as you are leveling up, you are going to want to be starting to put some points into dexterity, especially if you focus on spells that have a long wind up to cast. Other than that, nothing much more else to mention. The prisoner has a extremely sort of lateral spread across the stats, which is good, and almost no points in faith and arcane, which again fits into the archetype, because we're never going to touch those stats at the beginning because we want to be focusing around intelligence mostly. But I just really like the high 15 mind on the astrologer and the 16, and that's why I chose the astrologer first. Now, when we go over to level progression, the idea here is I performed 4 slices here, so at 25, at 50, at 75, and at 100, and how I would level the character those first 100 levels. Now, some people will literally play this game once and they'll only level one class, and they'll only finish the story mode once, and they might only get to level 100 once. And so this can be a suggestion as to how you would progress that, and I'll explain my choices as we go along. But again, There are many ways to skin a cat here, and this is by no means a do it this way or you will fail, you know, methodology. But let's see. So, you know, we're starting out at 6. When we look at our first slice here, which is level 25, means that by that time we will have accumulated 19 additional stat points. Now, with those 19 additional points, I'm going to use 14 of those to punch up my intelligence up to 30, to get to like high intelligence as fast as possible. Now, the thing that we have to remember about, you know, intelligence is this is where the majority of our damage comes from at a low level, but it's also governing which spells we can cast, because most sorceries have a intelligence requirement before you're even able to cast them. Now, also at the same time as well, we do want some survivability, and this is something that new players tend to neglect. A lot of new players that are playing a sorcerer or something truly embrace the glass cannon life, and so you hardly ever touch your vigor, you never level up your HP, because you figure if you put enough stuff into intelligence, if you put enough stuff into your damage, you kill things before they can get to you or before they can deal damage to you, aka glass cannon, you know, no problemo. The real problem with that is the fact that there are certain mechanics in this game, and again, this is when you get past the first couple of bosses that you have to kill, that the bosses do massive AoEs. They sometimes do damage that is simply unavoidable, and you have to take at least some of it, or you have to survive one hit so that you can start fielding your abilities and essentially kill the boss. Now, a lot of bosses have one hit potential no matter what, but you will start noticing that up until the point where you get your vigor to about 20, maybe 25, you really are super brittle, and even like little enemies out in the field can actually cause you a lot of harm. So here we can see that we're already starting to push up vigor a little bit so that we get a little bit more HP there. At the same time as well, we're also starting to just put some points into, sorry, I was just double checking something. We're starting to put some points into mind. The reason for this is, of course, mind governs our FP, our focus, our mana pool. And so you have a potion, of course, that you can drink to bring this back up. But the more costs you can get out of one FP pool, the better for you and the better for long term to survive. Now, once we get to 50, that's going to give us another 25 points that we can invest. And at this point in time, you'll notice that I've left the sorceries, or I've left the intelligence at 30. I haven't touched it. I haven't put a single point into it. And most of my points now from 25 to 50 are actually going into survivability and I would say utility to a degree. Now, while we're talking about intelligence, a quick little side note into sorceries in the game. So specifically when it comes to the sorceries, we have 71 sorceries that are available in the game. And essentially this is how they sort of stack in terms of the intelligence requirements. So you have like 4 of them that require between 0 to 10 in int, and then so on and so forth. I'm not going to read all of these for you, but basically you can see that by the time you get to level 30, or you get to 30 points, rather not level 30, don't let me confuse you, you get to 30 points in int, you are going to be able to cast 50 of the 71 sorceries in the game. So 30 gives you access to almost basically 70% of the sorceries that are available to you in the game, and some really strong options are there. So if we just look here, that means that it's all of these. There we go. So you get some really good ones here, like you have Carrion Piercer, you have Loretta's Great Bow, you have Carrion Greatsword, you have Meteorite. Ambush Shot is here. There's a whole bunch of really strong spells that are available to you here that are Magic Glint Blade is fantastic. Carrion Slicer is good. There's a bunch of really good spells in here that you are essentially going to be using to cast most of your damage and to cause most of your damage. So that's why we try to get to 30 as fast as possible, so that we have access to all of these spells, but also at the same time so that we deal enough damage with those spells. So back here again, and as we were talking about getting to level 50, we are focusing on putting a lot of points into vigor, a lot of more points into mind, and quite a few points into endurance here as well. The reason here, very simple. Around 50, and it's actually quite simple and fast and easy to get to level 50 in Elden Ring, but at the same time, this is where you're going to start facing a lot of, you know, different kinds of bosses that engage you at range, bosses that are bruisers, that jump on you and try to deal damage to you by just massive combos in your face the whole time, and you're going to start facing weird things like poison and stuff like that. The thing is, at this point in time, it's important for you to start learning evasion and just essentially dodging at the right time and all of that stuff, but also to start learning that sometimes you just make mistakes and you have to take hits. The best way to do that is to actually give yourself the ability to survive some of those hits. And so the point is, once we raise our vigor to 26, this gives us quite a pretty big, so you know, HP pool. And we raise our mind to 22, so this is going to give us a lot of focus points, so we can push out a lot of spells before we have to drink up again, which actually allows you to play around with your mix of, you know, how many potions you allocate for health and how many potions you allocate for mana, aka FP, so that you can maybe favor a few more into health, which means you can survive some encounters longer as well. And then last but not least, endurance in this game is essentially your stamina pool. So it predominantly governs two things, and that is how much stamina you have in an encounter, so how many times you can dodge roll before you exhaust that. But also as a sorcerer, you'll realize that when you cast spells in combat, it actually costs this as well. It costs this as a resource as well. So while you'll never be able to level this up to a point where it's not a problem, eventually everybody runs out of stamina. Stamina management is a very important thing in From Software games, and so for in this game as well. So it is important that we do give ourselves a little bit more points into stamina as well, so that we can dodge more, but that we can also cast more spells, chain casting them in a row before our stamina runs out and we have to wait to regenerate. Then moving on to the gap between 50 and 75 is going to give us another 25 stat points. And here now you'll see that I'm actually starting to push some points into dexterity, because dexterity governs a bunch of things, like you can fall a little bit farther without taking damage, you can survive a little bit more damage before you get knocked off the horse, but also dexterity for a caster allows you to cast spells quicker. Now you in testing for me, but you can definitely test this yourself as well, there is a noticeable difference between having 10 dexterity and trying to cast a spell with a wind up, and then having 20 dexterity and trying to cast. There is a noticeable difference. There's of course also talismans in the game that can help you by lowering the casting speed, as well as staffs in the game that can do that. So you have some options here, but we're also starting to push more into intelligence at this gap here, because now we want access to more powerful spells, and at 42 we have an additional bevy of spells that come in, but we also want those spells to hit harder. What's also important is that during this time from 25 to 75, that you also are spending resources to actually upgrade your staff. So whichever staff you settle on using, whether that's the astrologer staff, which is really good, that comes with the astrologer obviously when you start as that class, and that you can take all the way up to 25, like plus 25, which gives you really good stat scaling. Or whether you take one of the other more powerful staffs in the game, like Azure or Lusat or something like that, and use those and level those up to plus 10. The point is that those point levelings in the weapons are in certain cases at certain thresholds actually more important for you, for your damage profile, than it is for you to add intelligence. And that's the other reason why in this gap here, I basically for about 50 levels, I don't touch int, because in that time I'm actually upgrading my weapon, and that is actually giving me quite a bit more, you know, better damage, a better damage profile, because the sorcery scaling or the int scaling on that is going up. So we are also again putting in some points into vigor here, again just enhancing our HP pool, and we're also just further developing our mana pool. Then last but not least, the last 25 points to our final slice in this view to get us to 100 gets us another 25. We now push all the way up to 40 for HP. We get all the way up to 30 for mind. We get up to 16, which is just one additional point for endurance. We push 2 points into strength. And the reason for this is that those two staffs that I mentioned before, Azure and Lusat, they actually have a strength requirement of 10 to use. So the 8 that you start with is simply not going to be enough, and you'll have to put 2 points into strength to get this, unless you're using a talisman or something like that to boost you up. Last but not least, we are pushing to 52 in intelligence. Now, as I've mentioned, you have to get all the way up to 70 intelligence to be able to cast all of the sorceries. As we know from our list that we looked at over here, we'll see that the final, to get from 60 to 61 to 70 gives us access to the final 2, but when we get to 52 we actually have 4 spells that we can cast. But more importantly, if you are interested in doing the spam sorcery or the cheese sorcery, which involves using Comet Azure, as you can see here, you are going to need 60 int. So you might be asking me, okay, cool, full measure, but that, when I get to 52 int here, I'm still 8 shy of the int that I need for Comet Azure, and that's where talismans come in. Now there are quite a few talismans, and at the back end of this video we're going to look at actual gear for my sorcerer, and I'll give some recommendations. but there are talismans that boost your int, and this is where this comes in. Or you can use a great rune or something like that. The very first great rune you get raises all of your attributes. So there are ways for you to access 60 int without actually putting the skill points into it, and that's why we're pushing to 52 here. Now, one final thing that we have to talk about here is the reason why I pushed to 40 vigor here is this is why that first video that I created is important. There are certain stat breakpoints, and if we look here, for instance, with vigor, we'll notice that we start seeing diminishing returns at 40 points in vigor. So you'll notice up until 40 we are getting this much per level, and then it starts dropping off, essentially a 50% reduction there. The same thing is true for some of the other decisions that we make, but specifically when we look at mind and when we look at endurance, their drop-offs are far later. So even as we have developed it here to 30 and 16 in endurance, there's a lot of room for growth here. And once we get past level 100, that's probably where you should be focusing your attention on. So that was a whole heck of a lot. But then one last thing that we can just sort of like comment on is, again, looking at those same slices, so starting at 6, then 25, 50, 75, and 100, this is essentially how your stats will develop. So looking at HP, we're seeing that we're starting out at 393, and eventually when we get to level 100, we have 1450 HP, which is super respectable and pretty decent. When it gets to focus, and focus is important here once again because it governs how many times we can cast a spell before we have to drink something, but also your top end of your focus value determines which summons you can summon. Some summons have an HP requirement to summon, and some of them have an FP requirement. And if you don't have enough, like if your maximum pool is 90 and the summon costs 105, then you're simply not going to be able to summon it. So by the time we get to 50, we already have 112. Now, at this point in time, we can already summon pretty much some of the best ones in the game. Of course, Mimic Tear in the game requires HP. It requires like 600 HP to summon. So that's no problem that you'll be able to summon and then just repot up. But if we're looking at something like Lutel or Oleg, both of them are just over 100 FP. So both of them are summonable as well. We also see that we have some development in stamina here over the time, and our equipment load eventually starting at 46.6 ends up, being at 57.7 when we get to level 100. Now, again, one last thing about equipment load, because this of course determines the kind of armor that you can wear before you have encumbrance and that you're too slow. So you always want to have decent like maneuverability, so you don't ever want to go to heavy encumbrance. Medium is okay, light is even better. But the bottom line is, this is one of the areas where we struggle as a caster, as a sorcerer, because we will tend to have to wear cloth or something like that, and that's not going to give us a lot of the defense that comes with some of the plate or the heavy, armor options. But that's the caster life, and that's just how it is. So then when we get to actual items in the game, and my suggestion for what you should be looking for in terms of a staff, which talismans you should use, we can definitely see that let me just get there quickly. So in terms of a staff, I'm using Lusat's Glintstone staff, which is fantastic because basically what it does is it actually empowers all of your sorceries at an additional FP cost, which is no problem, because if you have enough FP, it just makes, obviously those abilities really punch. But the point is, the astrologer staff, which I've also leveled up to plus 25, is no slouch and is a fantastic option until very late in the game if you choose to not go after any of these other two options for whatever reason that might be. Azur's glint staff is also pretty good. The point is that Azur doesn't actually increase the power, but increases the casting, or decreases rather, let me say that. It reduces the casting time of all of your sorceries, but also uses more FP. So this, alongside the Lusat, they have the same FP incurring penalty where spells cost more, mana to cast. But in the case of Azur, it makes you cast those spells quicker, which is pretty cool. Or in the case of Lusat, it actually makes them deal more damage. Now, there are some other options as well. The Meteorite staff is phenomenal, especially if you focus into gravity-based sorceries like Rocksling. And you can't really go wrong with I mean, even an Academy Glintstone leveled up has got decent scaling. But definitely your four options that I would consider here is the Astrologer staff, Azur, Lusat, and of course the Meteorite staff. Now, when we get over to the armor itself, again, the astrologer set that you start the game with is perfectly fine. And really, as a caster, you don't have a lot of like crazy other options that are available to you. Now, what's important to notice is that the robe, the gloves, and the boots don't really matter. The bonus effects that we get in the game are actually coming from the headpieces. So I use the Azur Glintstone crown, and the reason for that being that this again raises the potency of any Azure based sorceries, so aka Comet Azure, which is the ion cannon ability in the game. This actually boosts the power of that, again at additional FP consumption. But of course, another option that's also fantastic is the Lusat's Glintstone Crown, because this actually increases other sorceries like anything from the moon's, the moon category. Now, some other really good options here, as well as any of these Glintstone Crowns, are fantastic because they actually increase your HP. So here's some of the options that I was referring to before, that if you want to get additional intelligence at the cost of maybe some HP or something like that, and not actually having to put the points into the game. Now, other than that, when it comes to talismans, this is where it gets really interesting, and definitely some fantastic choices here. Let me actually just change this one quickly, because I was doing some XP farming, so that's not the usual one I have. So just explaining them from left to right, the Primal Glintstone Blade, again, spells consume, so in this case I'm saying that spells consume less HP, but I take an HP penalty here. So this is a way for me to essentially counteract all of this additional FP that it's costing me because of the fact that I have Lusat and because I have the Azure Glintstone Crown on. So this kind of like offsets some of that penalty, and that's why I use it. The Graven Mass Talisman and the Graven School Talisman do exactly the same thing. They just have different percentage levels that they do it at. So the first one, the Graven Mass Talisman, says that it greatly raises the potency of sorceries. This is about 8% that it increases it by. Now this stacks with the Graven School Talisman, which says it raises the potency of sorceries, because this one is about 4%. So if you combine both of those in your talisman bar, you're actually getting 12% additional damage to your sorceries. And then last but not least, the Godfrey icon. This enhances charged spells and skills. So this is good for even classes that are using skills that charge and not necessarily spells. But this makes any spell that you charge up to use, like for instance the Comet Azure, but any spell that you can hold in the cast button to actually charge up the potency. So that can be most of the beam spells, most of the shot spells in the game, even the blades like glints, if you use the carrion spells and you charge up the blade before you chop down, this is actually going to increase the damage from all of those as well. But that's pretty much it for the video. I know it was a super long one, so thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. There will be an additional sort of addendum to this where I will discuss what I think are some of the best sorceries in the game. I didn't want to add that onto this video because we don't want this thing to be like 40 minutes long, but that can be a specific discussion. I also think it's incredibly subjective because it depends on the kind of sorcerer that you want to be. If you want to use some of like the close range options in like blades and things like that, or whether you prefer using the cheese with Comet Azure, or whether you prefer standing in the back and casting spells and running around and being a little bit more agile. So definitely there is some choice available to you there, and again, there are some contenders which critically stand out above others. But again, I also, with enough intelligence, with enough positioning, and with enough understanding the game, I don't think you can really go wrong with most options. But again, like I said, thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me. Let me know in the comments down below any other additional questions that you have about casters. I think I covered most of it, but of course, let's use the comment section to add any additional questions, anything that we have there, and also to make some suggestions to me on things which I didn't consider or that I would add on. As always, my door is open and I am fully ready to be blown away by the comments. But that's it. It is super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, a great afternoon, and a very, very awesome evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me.